Everyone knows that the real estate market is on fire right now. Properties that are listed are receiving multiple offers within 30 minutes. And this also means that there are a lot of non traditional methods for closing, including what's called a land contract. Now, land contracts have been around forever, but back in the day they weren't as popular because there are some serious drawbacks. However, land contracts are being utilized now because they can often avoid a bank, and financing can be one of the biggest hurdles for a buyer. So let's talk about what a land contract is and considerations that you need to know before entering into one.
The right lawyer makes the difference. AFJ Law Group.
I'm attorney Alexis Johnson of AFJ Law Group, a business litigation firm specializing in business, real estate transactions, and estate planning. If you'd like to receive weekly legal informative videos like this one, be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Today we're talking all about land contracts, which is a contract involving a parcel of land with property on it between a buyer and a seller. Now, typically in a real estate setting, the buyer receives title to the property at closing. But what you may not know is that there's two forms of title. First is equitable title, which is the right to retain ownership of the property. The second is legal title, which is actual ownership of the property. Now, as I said, in a traditional setting, the buyer will receive both forms of title at closing. But in a land contract, it differs because the buyer will hold equitable title while the seller retains legal title until the contract is completed. So as a buyer or a seller, you may be wondering, why would I want to enter into a land contract versus doing a traditional method where everything passes at closing? There's a lot of benefits to a land contract that we'll talk about in depth further in this video. But the main thing is financing. Now, in a traditional real estate setting, you're working with a bank or a mortgage lender to obtain financing to purchase the property. Banks aren't as involved in a land contract. The seller controls a lot of the terms, including the credit requirements, down payment, and the parties are able to even negotiate monthly payment as well as interest rate. This gives a lot of autonomy that you don't see in the traditional real estate transaction setting, and it can be advantageous to certain parties. It just depends on your specific situation and whether or not it's right for you. So let's talk a little bit more about some other pros and cons to a land contract so that you can decide.
While financing is one of the most attractive pros for a land contract, there are several other reasons someone may choose to sell or buy real estate under a land contract. First, a land contract can make the property easier to sell. Since the seller is the qualifying agent and controls the stipulations of the land contract, the seller can set their own requirements for the creditworthiness of the buyer, the amount of down payment, or any other items that might typically be dictated by a bank or mortgage lender. And since the seller is setting the terms and conditions, they can establish payments that fit within the buyer's budget and utilize an option of accelerating the loan as needed. The parties have much more autonomy. Next, there can be tax advantages using the installment sale method depending on your local and state laws. The seller of a land contract can also enjoy regular cash flow without the headaches of managing a rental property. It's important to understand that even though a land contract is an installment sale, the seller is not the landlord and the buyer is not a tenant. For all intents and purposes, the buyer is in the same position he would be in if the property was purchased in a traditional setting, except the seller retains legal title until the sale is actually completed. As a buyer, a land contract can be a great way to gain control of property with little upfront cash. And finally, there are options for sellers in case of non-payment, where the forfeiture period for a land contract is only 90 days from the date of filing, and the paperwork very similar to that of tenant evictions. Now, with all that being said, there are a few downsides to selling or buying on a land contract, but here are the main two. First, as we discussed earlier, legal title does not pass to the buyer until the land contract is complete. This can impact both the buyer and seller in different ways. For example, a government-based property maintenance inspection could interpret that the ownership of the property, and therefore the maintenance of the property, is also the responsibility of the seller, even if the land contract says otherwise. This means that a seller may be responsible for certain property maintenance even if the buyer was originally charged with the task. The next major drawback is potential issues if a seller defaults on an underlying mortgage for the property. Typically, unless the seller owns the property outright, he is still making payments to a lending institution. If, for any reason, the seller does not make regular payments, the property can still be foreclosed on, leaving the buyer with a worthless contract and no home. There are other considerations, especially dealing with the forfeiture process, that you should understand and seek legal counsel to fully appreciate before entering into a land contract.